Wallace Stegner lecture on Eating Our Way Through the Anthropocene with Jessica Fanzo. These are extraordinary and challenging times. Not only are we dealing with the nationwide coronavirus crisis, but in Salt Lake City, we experienced a 5.7 earthquake this morning that has closed the university and the airport temporarily. But notwithstanding that, let us thank you for joining us remotely today for our Wallace Stegner lecture, which is the usual kickoff to our annual symposium. We're disappointed that we will not be able to gather in person today for our Stegner lecture and tomorrow for our annual symposium, given recent developments and ongoing concerns about the spread of COVID-19. We are, however, grateful that we can gather online for Jessica Fanzo's presentation, and we hope that you can join us tomorrow for our virtual symposium on food and the environment, resilient and equitable food security for the West. We are able to offer these events online and on short notice, I should add, thanks to our remarkable technical team at the College of Law. And in that regard, let me call out Lance Finch and Sam Mills, who have been very helpful, along with Mark Beekhuizen and Crystal Begley, all of whom are responsible for making this happen today. If you would like to ask questions, simply click on the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and type in your question. Our speaker and moderator will be able to see all of the questions and will respond in time. We're very grateful to our donors who support our annual symposium and the Stegner lecture. I know you join me in thanking the following donors. Our principal funding for these events comes from the R. Harold Burton Foundation, which is the founding donor and has provided principal funding for the symposium since 1996. In addition, the Cultural Vision Fund is also a major funder. It provides support for a variety of Stegner Center programs, including the symposium, our Young Scholar program, and our various lecture series. In addition, the symposium is sponsored by the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, the Nature Conservancy in Utah, and the Student Natural Resources Law Forum at the Quinney College of Law. If you're interested in registering for the symposium, that can be done online at the Stegner Center website. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our Wallace Stegner lecturer. Jessica Fanzo is the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor of Global Food and Agriculture Policy and Ethics at the Berman Institute of Bioethics, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and the Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. She also serves as the director of the Hopkins Global Food Policy and Ethics Program. From 2017 to 2019, Jessica served as the co-chair of the Global Nutrition Report and the UN High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Systems and Nutrition. Before coming to Hopkins, she held positions at Columbia University, the Earth Institute, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the World Food Program, Bioversity International, and the Millennium Development Goal Center at the World Agroforestry Center in Kenya. Jessica has a PhD in nutrition from the University of Arizona. She's eminently qualified to speak on the subject of food and the environment, and we're very grateful to Jessica that she's able to join us online today. Jessica, the screen is now yours. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bob. Thanks for the invitation from you and Robin and Jan at the Wallace Stegner Center and the College of Law at University of Utah. I'm really sorry to hear about the earthquake. I'm glad everyone is okay there. I am sitting in DC, a very quiet DC, pretty much a shut down DC. You know, all the bars, restaurants, Hopkins, everything is closed. These are really, really surreal, unprecedented times. So it's great that people can join amidst the chaos of changing of workplaces and lifestyles and people working from home. So I'm really pleased to see that we have so many people who've called in. I'm going to get our minds off of the COVID-19 for about an hour and talk about the Anthropocene and the role of food systems in the Anthropocene. I am going to share my screen now, and please let me know if you can see it. Oops, I need to share. Let me just quickly. Okay, hopefully you can see. Okay. Can you all see my screen? I hope so.
Yep, it's coming through just fine, Jessica.
Okay, great. Thank you. So today I thought we could talk about the Anthropocene for a little bit and the role of food systems. Food systems are both victims as well as instigators of climate change and disruption that we're seeing in the world. We'll talk about diets. Diets are born out of food systems and how diets are changing and contributing and also will be impacted by climate change. Some ethical questions to consider, and then a bit on solutions and discussion on, can we have it all? Can we have human and planetary health? So the Anthropocene is a term that has popularity. It is defined as the most recent geological time period being human influenced. There's overwhelming evidence now that atmospheric, geological, biospheric, and other Earth system processes and boundaries are now being significantly altered by the human being, human species. This term has been around since the 70s. Paul Crutzen had termed it and wrote a paper following in Nature called The Geology of Mankind. And it's really caught on as this incredible momentum of the human footprint on the planet. And there's been many papers and reports that have come out in the last few years talking about the Anthropocene, the sixth extinction, the issue around the planetary health. And I think many of you have probably read some of these reports, or at least some of the media coming out of the role of human-induced climate change. Most countries in the world very much resonate with this idea of human-induced climate change, with the exception really of one country, that being the United States, that doesn't acknowledge that climate change that we're seeing is human-induced. Hence, the United States not ratifying the Convention of Parties, the COP Paris Agreement. So we're really at an interesting point right now in the world. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put out a report in 2018 really examining what will the world look like when we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we're certainly will hit in the next 15 years. And they argue that the world will start to look very different, and avoiding that 1.5 degree world will require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes across all aspects of society. So we're not just talking about climate change, we're talking really about everything change. Everything will need to really change. And an interesting paper came out from Ripple and colleagues in 2017, looking at a paper that was published 25 years ago. In 1992, a group of scientists got together and issued a warning to humanity. And they predicted that lots of different things were going to happen with Earth systems, beyond just the temperature change, the world becoming warmer and CO2 emissions rising, that we would see a lot of detrimental impacts on natural resources and the planet. And Ripple and colleagues looked 25 years later and asked, well, were these scientists right? Were their predictions and their modeling correct? And that's where you see this black line in which most of the indicators we see that, such as freshwater resources declining, total deforestation, dead zones increasing, vertebrate species abundance declining, all of these turned out to be true. And what was more alarming is that it was the pace of change in the last 2 decades. The loss of forests, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of species, the increase in temperature. We're seeing the pace of change really accelerate over the last decade or two, which really raises the alarm bells. Well, what about food systems? So for us, we're going to be talking about food the next few days. Here is just a framework of food systems. This was something we established as part of the UN high-level panel of experts on food systems that convened in 2017. And we created this very kind of ugly framework of boxes and arrows, but it really takes you through the food system. Food systems are made up of supply chains. It starts, of course, with agriculture and food production systems. And food is stored, distributed, processed, packaged, and it moves to markets. Then food enters what we call the food. This is the place where you, as the consumer, you walk into a market, you walk into a restaurant. Well, now you're walking down to your refrigerator because you're confined to your house if you're in COVID situations. And your food environment is the place where you're making a choice of what to buy or what to order. You bring with yourself individual factors, your willingness to pay, your knowledge, your aspirations, your desires, how far you are from the market, how much time you have to spend in that market. But that market, that food environment, also is influencing your decisions. What kind of food is available? How much does it cost? What's the product properties, the quality, the branding? Is there an organic label on it? What are the types of vendors? Is it an organic market, a farmer's market, a corner store 7-Eleven? What's the advertising, the buy one, get one free? A lot of signals influence decisions of consumers of what they want to buy. And some of it is quite perverse, of course. Some of it can be beneficial, but a lot of it is directing consumers in certain ways. And of course, this influences behaviors, it influences diets, and the plethora of outcomes of the food system. And what I focus more on, nutrition and health outcomes, but there's many other outcomes, socio-cultural, economic, and environment. And along the top are these exogenous drivers that are influencing and shaping and transitioning these dynamic food systems: climate change, urbanization, population pressure, trade policies, subsidy policies, politics. So these are all influencing the food system in different ways. And we've seen this significant acceleration of the food system in that many things have changed over time. I mean, the land used to grow agriculture has grown over the last few decades, but now plateauing to be about 40% of all arable land used for agriculture. Beef production's been increasing. Pesticide and fertilizer use has been increasing. The food system has been significantly changing in both positive and negative ways, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But in the context of this seminar, we know that food systems are contributing to the changing climate. when we think about the roughly 40% of the Earth's land used for food production, when we look at that 40%, there's been a lot of calculations looking at the total greenhouse gas emissions coming from that. And what you see is the total greenhouse gases is about a quarter of the global greenhouse gases coming from agriculture, outside of transportation and energy sectors. And that 25% is coming from not only cows, the ruminant enteric fermentation producing methane, quite a toxic greenhouse gas, but many other contributors to move that beef around, waste, manure management, but just energy coming from agriculture sector. Rice production produces a lot of methane. Fertilizers produce a lot of greenhouse gases as well. So in total, about 25% of agriculture is contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And that's really looking more at the production, but we don't really know if food moves along supply chains or value chains. There's lots of vulnerable points when we think about the impacts of climate disruption. We can think about food safety. We're dealing with that issue right now with COVID, not related to climate, related to potentially consuming wild animals. But we can think about a lot of other vulnerable points around transportation and storage and marketing and retail around food prices. So what we know has not totally been modeled across the entire supply chain. There's a lot of other vulnerable points, and I'm just going to highlight a few. We know that climate, when we model climate, and this is looking at a 3-degree world, the quantity of crops is going to change. The ability to aim number of crops and the total amount of those crops will change. And we see that the global south is particularly affected with declines in yields across crops of the major crop commodities. Places in the north, like Canada, are going to do quite well in a 3-degree world, which is a pretty dire world to be in. But mostly you see a lot of red, meaning negative yields of major crops. When we look at water stress in the context of climate, a scenario of a convergent world, which there's economic growth. It's not a utopian world, but a scenario where you still have some climate change happening, but economic growth as well. You see a lot of water stress. Again, here's the border of the Sahara. You see a lot of water stress. A lot of water stress into South Asia, Middle East, where this will get even more difficult to be able to grow the types of crops that we want to continue to grow and feed the world. We can also look at in a business as usual, so trajectories now and what climate change will look like, and the threat to species extinction. And you see, again, significant threats to species extinction in many parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, South America being hit. And in a taking action approach where there's conservative action to address and mitigate climate change, you see some protection, but still some significant species loss as well. And when we look just at crops and the quality of crops, the nutritional quality in a CO2 fertilization effect, in which we have more CO2, more emissions, you see declines in the quality of crops. So declines in zinc, iron, and protein across wheat, rice, soybeans, maize, some of the major crops, which is pretty significant conclusion from Sam Myers and others at Harvard doing these studies, and that, you know, this is looking just at 3 nutrients across a few crops, but We don't know the range of potential nutrient loss across a range of crops depending on where they're grown. So this is shedding some light on not only will the quantity of crops decline, but the quality as well. Just so you all know, I'm going to depress you a little bit at the beginning, but I hope we end on an enlightening note. And also, you know, food safety will continue to be a big issue. This is showing you maize in present in a 2-degree and then a 5-degree world, which is you know, incomprehensible type situation. And this is aflatoxin, a mycotoxin that is an issue, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa with peanuts and maize and some rice. And you can see the amplification of aflatoxin in the EU range in a warmer world. So when we look across different food groups, this was work that we did as part of the Eat-Lancet commission that came out in January 2019. And we looked across several environmental indicators, not just greenhouse gases, which is these first 2 bars, but we also looked at changes in land use, changes in the water footprint, nitrogen and phosphorus applications. And we looked at present day and in 2050 in a business as usual approach, and looked at different different food groups. And the red is animal products. So you can see that animal products have a big greenhouse gas footprint, even out into 2050. When you look at other crops, they too have environmental footprints. Fruits and veg can have a big water footprint, nitrogen application footprint, and phosphorus application footprint. And staples also have a big environmental footprint across the 5 indicators. Obviously, 50% or more of these staples are being fed to animals that we then consume. So the animal footprint is more. But the important thing to think about when you look at these food groups is it really depends on how these foods are grown, where they're grown, and by who, and their whole life in the life cycle from growth to cradle to grave, as they call it. The whole life cycle assessment of these foods really depends on where and how they're grown. And so tomatoes grown in a hothouse are very different than tomatoes grown in another way. So it's not just that cows are the only enemy is from the food world. There's other foods that have certain environmental footprints. So it's important to look at how foods are grown and also looking at different environmental footprints, not just greenhouse gases. But the animal source food does have a significant footprint on the planet. Well, our diets now are born out of these food systems, and diets matter. We all eat a diet every day. It keeps us alive, but it also helps us thrive. It brings us together culturally. Food plays a central role in society across many different factors. For some, it's an inherent part of their livelihood. It's very important for indigenous peoples who center their life around food production. So diets are really an important measure in looking at the health of the food system. And this is a busy graph, but an important one. This was data that we published with the Global Burden of Disease Project led by Ashkan Afshan, and it shows diets around the world. So this is estimated intake data of diets globally are in gray, and then regional, sub-regional are in the different colors. And the top 5 bar graphs show you the healthy components of a diet. So the fruits, the vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. Below are the less healthy components of a diet. Red meat, or you need less red meat. Red processed meats, so that's the salted cured meats. Sugar sweetened beverages, trans fats, and sodium. And the green hash is showing you what people should strive to get to. And you can see that overall, globally and sub-regionally, most people in the world are not eating enough fruits. Very few regions are meeting the vegetable intake, with the exception of Central Asia. Legumes, some populations in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa are reaching that requirement. Whole grains, no one. Nuts and seeds, no one. Now, when you look at the unhealthy, you see many people are meeting the red meat limit, really, it's a limit, or going way beyond, United States being one. Processed meats, many in Asia, Latin America, EU. Sugar sweetened beverages, the green is over here. Basically, you don't need any in your diet, and everyone is over that limit. Trans fats being banned largely from the food supply, and then sodium, people going above. So the diets are of not high quality. We're moving towards less healthy diets. And what's resulted is a massive malnutrition burden in the world. 1 in 3 people are malnourished. If we don't do anything in the next 10 years, 1 in 2 will be malnourished. And if you look at these stats, they're really just unbelievable, because we now have 821 million people who will go to bed hungry. And that number's been rising for the last 3 years after significant declines, this graph shows you, over the last 15 years. And we're seeing a reverse of this. And the UNFAO argues that this increase in hunger is due to conflict and climate change. We still have 150 million children who are stunted or chronically undernourished. They're cognitively impaired for life if not acted on in the first 5 years. And one could argue this doesn't seem like a lot, but this is actually about 25% of the world's children under the age of 5. This is debilitating for individuals, families, and countries. 50 million children are acutely malnourished or wasted. Seasonal hunger, famines, conflict all contribute to this, and these children are at very high risk of mortality. 40 million children under the age of 5 are overweight, which is exponentially rising, along with adolescent obesity. And 2.1 billion adults are overweight and obese, which is just a massive, costly burden to society. And diets are a big contributor to this malnutrition burden. When we look just at deaths and DALYs, disability, we see that diets are the #1 contributor now to death and disability. The #1 contributor, more than air pollution, more than smoking. It's these unhealthy diets, which are meant to nourish us, are now killing us. And again, these diets are diets high in sodium, low in the good stuff, the whole grains, the fruits, the nuts, the seeds, the vegetables. These are the biggest contributors to death and disability now in the world. And what most people are dying from are non-communicable diseases: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer. So we've shifted from communicable to non-communicable. And you really see this in places of low and middle income contexts. A Lancet series came out, Hopkins showed that we're seeing a significant double burden of undernutrition and overweight and obesity in low and middle income contexts. So this is a really costly, detrimental situation that we have on our hands. And part of the Eat-Lancet, a healthy reference diet was recommended, very controversial, which I'm happy to talk about, where animal source foods were significantly limited. So if we want to, the idea of the Eat-Lancet was, if the world were to eat a healthy diet, what would that healthy diet look like and stay within the planetary boundaries? And here you can see the health boundary of the Eat-Lancet diet in orange hatch. And when we looked at the world's diet, we see that People are eating way too much animal source foods and way too much starch. Here's North America. A lot of animal source foods, starchy staples, and not enough of the good stuff, the fruits, the veg. Here's Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of starchy staples, not enough of the good stuff, but not too much on animal source foods. And here's South Asia. And when I see these circles, to me, this just shows inequity. Some places in the world, some high-income countries are just consuming way too much, way too many animal source foods, more than they need to meet their dietary needs, blowing out the planetary boundaries. Whereas other places are within the boundary, are not getting enough of the good stuff, but are not really, their diets are not really contributing to climate change. So there's a real inequity of who eats what kind of foods and the impact on human health and the planet. So maybe just some ethical questions that I think about that'd be interesting to get all of your feedback on. So we know that in some places in the world, we can take the United States as being one example, have very energy intensive lifestyles and very energy intensive dietary choices. And those will significantly contribute to human health costs as well as the climate change disruption that we're seeing. But the economically poor households are those who will disproportionately suffer the impacts of climate. We're already seeing that in many places in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia. People are moving, they're migrating, and they are not really those that are consuming and excessively and not eating these diets that are so environmentally intensive. And so it begs the question of, do we have the right to eat wrongly at this stage when we are a global connected world, as we saw with COVID in the last 2 weeks? We are very connected, and our food systems are connected, and what we eat does matter. We've been looking at 2 pastoralist groups in Kenya and looking at their impacts on climate change. So these 2 groups that we looked at, the Berman and the Turkana, they're nomadic, they roam with their animals. There's a lot of pressure for these pastoralists to settle, and they're dealing with food and water insecurity. They're dealing with land competition. A lot of that, the overarching issue is climate. And so we've been looking at how these pastoralists cope, and does this whole climate change, acute climate change adaptation for these pastoralist tribes impact conflict amongst the different tribes. So we've been doing some work looking at, this is a complex graph, but we're looking at coping strategies of how they deal with their physical resources, their income, and their assets, and does it help them cope under this very, very, really difficult time. These tribes are some of the most vulnerable to climate change. Another issue that is thought about a lot is how to address the inequities of diets around the world. And this graph is showing you work from Derek Hetty and Harold Alderman, looking at the cost of animal source foods around the world. And they looked at different types of animal source foods, and you can see high to low income. And in low income countries, these animal source foods are just so much more expensive due to broken value chains, the inability to trade blue ocean. Eggs are very difficult to trade across the ocean. And they're incredibly expensive for low-income households, low-income countries. So there's a real inequity in what we pay for our diets as compared to other places in the world. We know that Americans pay between 10 and 15% of their total income on food, whereas places like Bangladesh, Nigeria, Rwanda spends 60–70% of their total income on food. And you can imagine with climate change and food price spikes, these households will really struggle to cope and be able to afford their diet. This was a paper that came out by Will Masters looking at the Eat-Lancet Commission and asking, well, is that Eat-Lancet diet recommended? Is it affordable? And they basically said, no, for 1.6 billion people on the planet, they cannot afford that healthy, sustainable diet. And mind you, that healthy, sustainable diet was low in animal source foods. And that study I just showed you by Derek Hetty argues that animal source foods are expensive. So if that Lancet diet had even more animal source foods recommended, that diet would be even more unaffordable for more people. So just the basic Eat-Lancet diet is not affordable for 1.6 billion people. And that's using a very conservative $1.90 per day, so of a poverty line. So there's probably even more people that can't afford the diet. Another ethical issue is, what are the implications of raising meat, raising meat amidst hunger? So Anne Lepay in the 1970s showed these footprints, and they've been refined, but we know that cows are energy intensive. They use a lot of energy, they use a lot of water, they use a lot of feed compared to other animal source foods like chickens or fish. But if half the cereal production is going towards meat, is that the right way to allocate resources when we still have so many people who cannot meet their basic caloric needs? It's a competition question. It's a priority question. Is that the right way to use the limited land that we do have on the planet? And the Eat-Lancet, what we did was, well, if the world were to stay in a business as usual, that's in the yellow bars, and waste 30% of the food that we currently produce, we waste 30% of that. And what if the world were to shift towards that Eat-Lancet diet, which is shown in green bars, and we cut food loss and waste in half? Well, this is what the food production systems would have to look like. So whole grains, no increase in cereal production, which is very different than how most subsidies are in the world, agriculture subsidies. And most of the research and development in agriculture goes towards improving cereal production. So that would have to look completely differently. Vegetables and fruits would need to go up 75 and 50%. Fish, legumes, and nuts would have to go up at least 50%. Fish coming from aquaculture, because we don't have the wild marine resources. We need to think about more sustainable aquaculture systems. Legumes and nuts would have to go up 150%. We don't have the varietals of nuts to be able to yield that much to feed the world currently, if we have to go up 150%. And this was the kicker and the most controversial part of the Eat-Lancet. Livestock industry was not happy. Red meat production would have to decline 65%. And that has significant implications on livelihoods, particularly ranchers and cattlemen's associations, etc. So this was a very controversial figure that came out showing you what the food production system would need to look like if we were to stay within planetary boundaries and for people to eat that Lancet diet. And another paper shows some of the findings coming from fruits and vegetables. This is Mario Herrera's group in Australia showing that if the world were to eat the 400 grams of fruits and vegetables recommended on a daily basis, we currently do not have that in the supply. We do not have enough fruits and vegetables to feed the world now, which is all in red showing you, and into 2050. We do not supply enough fruits and vegetables to meet our basic needs. And the last is, what options are ethically permissible and acceptable? You know, consumers are in this very confusing time right now where, a lot of alternative proteins are coming out, Beyond Meat, Impossible burgers. But we also have a lot of companies working on lab-grown meats, cultured meats, finless foods, fish grown from stem cells, for example. There's the whole insect world, which some cultures regularly consume, others do not at all and find it very disgusting to consume insects. So, what kind of options will consumers accept, and what will become intractable issues like the GMO space? It's an interesting time that we're living in, seeing this rapid change. And one project we're working on at Hopkins is looking at what interventions and policies are ethically permissible for altering beef production and consumption practices in the US. And just to give you a little bit of a snapshot, some early data, we've been asking consumers in Nevada and California to group foods. And these are all the foods that we ask them to group. And typically, Americans will group foods around food groups like the dietary guidelines do. So people will group the foods around meats, eggs, dairy, vegetables. But the few foods that they were unable to group were plant-based milk, Impossible burger, and in vitro burgers. And there's a pizza and macaroni and cheese, junk food, and instant noodles. But it's really interesting that these new emerging alt protein products, consumers in the United States were unable to put them in a food group. And I find that's quite fascinating. They didn't really know what they were. So I'll end with just a few slides. Can we have it all? Can we have human health, improve diets, and stay within planetary boundaries? So save ourselves and save the planet. Well, a lot of reports have come out this last year, a dozen or so, on food systems and climate. And all of them call for massive transformation. We can't just tinker around the edges. We're at a point now where we need to significantly transform food systems to ensure that everyone gets access to a healthy, sustainable diet. The other thing we need is that we need countries to have food systems policies. We have agriculture strategies, we have dietary guidelines, we have nutrition policies, but there's not one country that has a holistic food system policy that brings together agriculture, nutrition, health, climate, biodiversity. We need more government action around holistic food system policies. And for governments to think about food as an entry point to better health, better economic development, education, culture and social cohesion, sustainable planet, conservation of natural resources, and of course, national security. Corinna Hawkes and Kelly Parsons at City University in London have this really great figure of this vision of food systems with co-benefits. And they talk about how this sweet spot where food can be this sweet spot for health, environment, and economies, and have all of these different policy goals from oceans, trade, health, finance, business. So food can really be seen as a way to improve multiple policies across the country. And we need to start thinking and prioritizing food in that way. A third thing, and this is something we recommended in the Eat-Lancet, was we need to consider keeping the food system within the environmental limits. And we modeled this. We modeled what that would look like in the Eat-Lancet. So the green is showing you the flexitarian diet, the more plant-based diet. The gray is showing you sustainable agriculture practices, technologies available now that could ensure that production practices are more sustainable. And yellow is having food loss and waste. And when you look across 5 environmental indicators, you see that diet has a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But sustainable food production technologies and having food loss and waste play a big role as well, particularly around land use change, water use, and nitrogen and phosphorus applications. So we need to be taking into account different approaches of many tools that are in the toolbox to address keeping food systems within planetary boundaries. Cynthia Rosenzweig at Columbia University and NASA had a great paper in Nature Food last month showing some of the different types of mitigation and adaptation strategies that can be done across food systems. And she ranks the potential of those from very high and dark green to gray as none, of different types of responses of improving crop management, improving livestock management, climate services on farms, improved supply chain and demand or dietary changes and food waste changes, and looks at the co-benefits, looking at livelihoods and biodiversity and health, and shows the different potential across mitigation and adaptation. And there's a lot that we know where if there was investment, if there was policy, there was investment, and there was the political will to take on these things, we could see some significant changes in the environmental footprint of food systems. And we need to help consumers, though. This is a big issue. You know, consumers are really confused. I mean, I'm a nutritionist and I'm confused by all the information out there. So we really need to be considering what is navigable for consumers. What is a sustainable diet? What's a healthy diet? What is the environmental footprint of certain foods? We need more clear, easily understandable information out there. And you know, Chile recently put into place a front of the pack label, a warning label showing putting a label on foods that were high in sugar, salt, and fat. And it helps consumers be able to navigate foods that were healthy or unhealthy in a very easy way. But Chile took it one step further in that they regulated that food. You can't sell it in a school. You can't advertise it on TV during child watching hours. So not only did they improve the labeling of those foods, but they regulated it. And a paper just came out showing that there's been a 25% reduction in purchases of those foods that have the warning label on the front. Consumers need more of those kind of tools to be able to make decisions in this complex space. And my last slide is really, we need an enabling environment. Governments need to care. They need to think about creating food policies and having a supportive political environment. Donors need to invest in food systems. We know the Global Nutrition Report that there's a real underfunding issue with nutrition. It's a very small amount that goes towards nutrition. Civil society needs to push governments to act and hold private sector accountable for behaving better across the food system. Private sector has a lot of power. It's a lot of power imbalance in the food system. We need governments to take control and shepherd their food systems in the directions that their citizens deserve. And of course, we need academia and research to continue to build this evidence base that's just now emerging, and really try to govern the conflicts of interest that keep arising in this nutrition space. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Jessica, thank you. We have some questions that I think are appearing on the screen that perhaps you can answer. I'm trying to make sure that I'm making things work. One question is about marine aquaculture as a next step. And the questioner suggests that in situ Atlantic salmon may not be a great choice there. Do you have recommendations of what kinds of aquacultured seafood people should be looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, there are, in the seafood area, there are consumer guides towards more healthy, sustainable seafood choices. There's been a few of those that have been released, but I think, you know, and World Wildlife Fund and National Geographic and others have come out with different kinds of guides. And if you go to WWF, they even have guides by country. So they'll have a guide for, you know, Romania, they'll have a guide for the Netherlands. But what isn't accounted for so much are these emerging aquaculture strains. And so I think we need more and more around not just wild caught foods, like the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a seafood watch guide, but we need also those coming from aquaculture, and I think that's going to be really important. But you know, there's a lot of innovation happening in aquaculture about different kinds of feed that are more sustainable. And so instead of feeding large salmon, omega-rich small fish that are the basis of the entire oceans and what all the other larger fish feed off of, you know, there's a lot of work on feeding algae and other things. So there's a lot of innovation happening in the EU actually around trying to ensure aquaculture is more sustainable, but we still have a long way to go. But of all the food groups, I feel the seafood has the most consumer guidance around it right now. But of course it can still be improved. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question that a couple of people have liked, overpopulation has not been addressed in the models.
Yeah.
How would the graphs change with population reduction?
It's a great question. You know, there was a really fascinating science paper.
Oops.
And they were looking at what you as the individual could do to lower your greenhouse gas footprint. You know, was it recycling? Was it driving a Prius? Was it your diet? And the number one is having one less child. You know, it's that one person's human footprint that's a significant contributor. So, you know, it's a great question. People talk about it in hush-hush terms, but it's one of these very sensitive topics. It gets quickly into rights and the rights to have children. And, but I'm sure that and I think there have been models looking at different population growth curves. But that's significantly one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a great issue. And it's the thing I find fascinating is that people don't really want to talk about it in the food and agriculture worlds. It's one of the things, you know, in the large debate of how are we going to feed 10, 12 billion people, population, family planning is never really mentioned. It's more about how do we improve yields of foods? How do we distribute food more equitably? How do we reduce food loss and waste? But the family planning issue is one that is really not addressed very frequently. So it's a great comment from the participant.
Thank you. Another question, what kind of government actions would you recommend, for instance, to reduce the consumption of animals?
I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk about a carbon tax, so high carbon foods, a tax, and obviously taxes are very controversial. Some see those as somewhat of a nanny state type policy. That's one potential way of that we've seen with soda taxes. Mexico, we've seen declines in purchases of sodas that have been taxed. I think there can be more consumer awareness when we were doing the interviews in the United States with consumers, a lot of consumers didn't know that cows had such an environmental footprint. So I think there needs to be a lot more awareness raising. The dietary guidelines of the United States could do that, but unfortunately, sustainability will not be addressed again in the 2020 dietary guidelines. So for another 5 years, sustainability is off the table, although it's been recommended in 2015 and now in 2020 it won't happen again. But dietary guidelines are another way to influence the public procurement systems, school meal programs, things like that. So it's unfortunately a loss for America.
Another sort of related question, what are the 3 most important steps that the United States could take immediately?
Yeah, great question. One is to ratify, agree, participate in the COP meetings. That would be great. Maybe vote for politicians who care about climate change and actually believe in it. So the 2020 election might be a big one. I'm not going to mention names of who does and who does not believe in climate change, but that could be probably the most important thing an American could do. Vote with your fork. If you care about climate change, vote for your local to national leaders who care about climate change equally. And that, of course, will then feed into the COP meetings, which are super important. And yeah, I mean, and for just at the individual level, thinking about your food, thinking about how much you buy. I think everyone's thinking about that right now with COVID, how much you buy or not, how much you waste, making concerted efforts to maybe not eat meat at every meal, maybe be a vegetarian by day and then partake in animal source foods at night. Maybe you don't need to eat meat at breakfast and lunch. These kind of small changes can be really important. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd probably be remiss if I didn't mention, at least where I am, that we just had another significant aftershock from our earlier earthquake.
Oh!
But we're well here. I hope others in the Salt Lake Valley area are also.
Oh my gosh. I didn't see you moving, Bob.
Yeah, I felt it. Let's put it that way.
Oh my gosh.
So we'll carry on at this point. We have another question about the young people running organic farms, being unhappy with the state of the world, anti-capitalist, anti-corporate power, and anti-government. And the question is, how do they figure into these changes we so desperately need?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in the international development community, there's a real push to engage youth. So I've been going to meetings, and 2 years ago, I would never see this, but I've been going to meetings now where I see a lot of teenagers, adolescents who get to speak. They're on panels, and they're from all over the world. And they're talking about their local food systems. They're talking about indigenous rights. They're talking about climate. So I think there's a real movement to include youth in these political dialogues. They have a voice. It's their future. It's odd that we talk about the future and they're not in the room. And I think, the Greta effect has really changed that viewpoint. She's forcing the hand of people to think very differently about these things. So I think we're really seeing a movement now around youth. And for any of you who are involved in kind of the politics of food, there will be a UN food summit in New York by the Secretary General has called for it in 2021. And there'll probably be a big youth coalition. So I encourage all of you, if you're sitting at universities or, have youth groups who care about food, to get involved in the UN Food Summit. University of Utah, you guys should have a student group go to New York and participate in that. There'll be a lot of action for youth as part of that, because they're the ones who will have to carry this burden, and we can help and facilitate that, but they will have to we have to listen to what they want. It's their future. So I think we're seeing big changes, but we need more youth being involved. And I wish that we had a youth movement in food like we are seeing in climate. Hopefully we will as time goes on.
Well, thank you for mentioning the meeting in New York coming up in a year, if I got the date correct.
Yeah.
Maybe when we're offline, we can get some information about that from you, and we'll make sure that's posted on the Wallace Stegner Center website.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Another question, from a sustainability and nutrition perspective, are products like Beyond Meats a clear benefit?
So yeah, that's been a kind of a controversial issue, is the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meats. Are they healthier? And I think we can argue that they have a benefit towards the environment and animal welfare, obviously on the animal welfare side, and the environment, lower environmental footprint when they've done life cycle assessments. On the nutrition side, not incredible, not great, still high in saturated fats. It's a very processed food. Lots of, beef burger has one ingredient, right? Impossible Burger has many ingredients. So if you are a person that likes clean labels, clean being very few ingredients, Impossible Burger is not your best friend. But from a health perspective, the profile is not great. So it's more about eating a food that tastes like meat somewhat, smells, looks, tastes like meat, but it's not meat. From an environmental and animal perspective, animal welfare perspective, it has benefits. But there's a lot of vegans are like, I don't like the taste of meat, so why would I have an Impossible Burger? Or why don't I just have a black bean lentil burger or something, right? So for some people, they're not really seeing the benefits of it, and I think those substitutes are more for those who care about the environment or care about animals, and but still kind of crave the taste of flesh.
Thank you. We'll all keep that in mind as we what our next burger is going to be. So another question, the responder says that she didn't see you mention much about informing or partnering with the healthcare system, especially doctors.
Yeah.
It seems that nutrition must be central to medical education. Eat less, exercise more. What about protein, sugar, carbs, and fats? What do you eat? But more important, what does your food eat?
Great question. Yeah, sorry, I didn't have time to mention that, but yeah, so the health professionals overall do not get a lot of training on nutrition in their medical school curriculum or their nursing school curriculum. Very little on diets. It's often just kind of left to the dietitians to do that. That has to change. There's more and more emphasis that if obesity is one of the ¡1 risk factors of death and disease, doctors need to understand the complexity of obesity and the role that diets play in that. And there's now a lot of programs looking at prescription type food programs where doctors prescribe subsidized healthy foods like fruits and vegetables that low-income consumers can get access to. So there's a lot of work happening in the health sector around these prescription food programs, which is really great. But I think more and more doctors need guidance on what is a healthy diet, if someone comes to them and wants to lose weight or they want to be healthier, do doctors have that information at their fingertips? And so that really requires the nutrition research community to be able to come to consensus on what are healthy diets and what does the latest data say. So I think it falls on the responsibility of the nutrition research community as well to help keep the health practitioner community informed. But it starts with the education side, right? The medical school doesn't even have nutrition in their curriculum, which is just crazy. But
so I'll jump in on that with a question related to it. Is the information that we get from the government periodically about the sort of food pyramid or food chart, is that helpful, or is that more political than nutritional in terms of its information?
Yeah, so the U.S. dietary guidelines come out every 5 years, and there's a scientific committee that is brought together to look at the evidence. Overall, yes, but there's a lot of controversy about who sits on there and their conflicts of interest. And there's a great book written probably now 15 years ago by Marion Nestle at NYU. And she wrote a book called Food Politics when she served on that dietary guideline committee. And she says it's kind of fraught with a lot of conflicts of interest. But overall, what is recommended in the dietary guidelines of the US is really consensus with other dietary guidelines around the world and the scientific literature. Every once in a while, you kind of scratch your head of why there's like it's now a plate, by the way, it's not a pyramid. But the plate has a glass of milk. Why is that? Why is it a glass of milk, right? You have to, it begs the question of, was there some sort of influence there? But that's my own take. But I think it gets political in the context of, can they add sustainability issues? And no, that was off the table. So that's where it gets very political. And the emerging science around sustainable diets is not there in the dietary guidelines, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Another question that we have, is there anything that you could say about the animal agriculture, particularly factory farming, and the connection with diseases, potential outbreaks of disease in light of our current coronavirus situation?
I mean, not really. This isn't my area. But you know, I know it's a deep concern, but particularly on antibiotic resistance. Antimicrobial resistance is becoming a significant issue. And we have some colleagues at Johns Hopkins who work on that space. And some argue that the AMR, antimicrobial resistance, will be a bigger pandemic than what we're seeing right now. And so these CAFO systems, these concentrated animal feed operations that we see in the US, some argue is a recipe for disaster from an antimicrobial resistance perspective. And that's why you're seeing laws in California trying to minimize use of antibiotics, which have a role to play in animal welfare in the sense of keeping disease at bay and things like that. And there's a lot of conversation right now about the environmental footprints of those CAFO systems versus grass-fed beef versus pastoralist type systems. So there's a lot of work right now about the different environmental footprints of different livestock systems around the world as well. Not everything, you know, a cow is not a cow is not a cow. So there's a lot of work on that front.
Related to that, question just popped up as to any comment on the claims that grass-fed rotational grazed beef is more sustainable and uses less resources and helps store carbon through soil restoration.
Some would argue yes. There's a great report by Tara Garnett and colleagues at Oxford it's called Grazed and Confused, which is a great name for a report. And she models all these different kind of livestock feed systems, and grass-fed is one. So this is very on par with Ireland, for example, will claim that their grass-fed beef is a much more sustainable system than the American system. You know, I think it just depends. You know, it depends on the inputs that are used around that grass. So in Ireland, you know, there's a lot of fertilizer used to grow that grass. So I think there's a lot of nuance around the conversation of what's the best animal system. But there's several colleagues. Patrick Holden is in the UK, and he really argues for grass-fed rotation animal systems are some of the most sustainable in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. And one broader question, as we work to regulate CO2 emissions, is there a potential to regulate the supply side of this challenge in the spirit of saving the planet and our species? So a sort of broad question there on CO2 emissions.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the area that we've seen a lot of work on, not only on farm production practices, you know, a lot taking a more agroecological approach. Some would talk about renewable agriculture and other types of approaches where you're using the ecosystems and the ecosystem services in a much better way. But I think there's also a lot that can be done across the supply chain, which climate modelers don't really model. Like what would it look like if the supply chain were to go more towards renewable energy, you know, and its transportation and its cold storage, you know, the energy used for cold chains. So I think there's a lot that can be done across the supply chains and using renewable energies and then on-farm sustainable practices. A lot of that, of course, available now. It's, you know, a lot of that is tied up into politics and infrastructure. But there's a lot that can be done across the supply chain to lower the footprint. And then, of course, the impact of cows. Can we move cows to a more sustainable feed system? So there's work being done right now to breed a cow that doesn't produce any methane, or feeding cows algae, which makes them produce less methane. So there's a lot happening around breeding of cows, feeding of cows, and using renewable energies around raising those cows. So there's a lot happening on the innovation side around the supply. The diet's the hardest part to change.
Well, I think we've pretty much reached the end. We really appreciate the time that you've taken with us, the knowledge that you've shared with us, Jessica. This is one in a line of just extraordinary Wallace Stegner lectures that we've had. And you've certainly contributed to our knowledge about food and the environment. I only wish that we had the opportunity to have you here with us in person, and we all had the opportunity to join together in person. But your presentation was just extraordinary, and I'm sure that everyone online joins me in extending our thanks to you for your presentation today, and we'll hopefully look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and I hope the aftershocks stop.
I just saw a note 4.6 on the aftershock. So hopefully we'll get through it here. Hopefully the worst is behind us, but you never know with these sorts of things. So you be well and be healthy, and the same to all of our audience. We greatly appreciate everyone joining us today for the Wallace Stegner Center lecture. Thanks again, and we're still hoping to move forward with the symposium tomorrow. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care too.